In 1823, a man walked into a hotel in Lynchburg, Virginia, handed the innkeeper a locked iron box, and told him not to open it. He said he would be back to collect it. He never came back. Inside that box were 3 sheets of paper covered in numbers. Hundreds of numbers arranged in rows, each one corresponding to a letter, each letter part of a message that described the location of a buried treasure so large that by modern estimates it would be worth somewhere between $400 million and $1 billion. One of those 3 sheets has been decoded. It was decoded in the 1880s, 60 years after the box was left, by a man who spent most of his adult life trying to crack all 3. What it described, when the numbers finally resolved into words, was staggering. Gold, silver, jewels. Buried somewhere in the hills of Bedford County, Virginia. Enough wealth to make every person involved in finding it rich beyond any practical need for the rest of their lives. The other 2 sheets have never been decoded. The first sheet tells you what is buried. The second sheet, the one that has never been cracked, tells you exactly where. This is the Beale cipher, and it is either the greatest unsolved treasure mystery in American history, a puzzle that has consumed mathematicians, cryptographers, historians, and obsessives for 2 centuries, or it is the most elaborate and successful hoax ever constructed. Both possibilities have been argued by serious people with serious evidence. Neither has been proven. And somewhere in between those 2 possibilities, in the gap between what can be demonstrated and what cannot be disproven, is the story of a man named Thomas Jefferson Beale. A man who may have been a pirate, may have been an adventurer, may have been a genius, may have been a fiction. A man who, if he was real, buried enough gold in the Virginia hills to change the lives of everyone who has ever gone looking for it. A man who, if he was not real, constructed a mystery so perfectly designed that it has been fooling people for 200 years. Either way, this is one of the most extraordinary stories in the history of buried treasure. And it starts not in Virginia. It starts at sea. Thomas Jefferson Beale first appears in the historical record in January 1820 when he arrived at the Washington Hotel in Lynchburg, Virginia. The hotel was run by a man named Robert Morris. And Morris, in the account that would eventually be published decades later, remembered Beale with a specificity that suggests either a genuine impression or a very carefully constructed portrait. He was, Morris wrote, a handsome man. Tall, around 6 feet, dark complexion, black eyes, a bearing that suggested someone who had spent time in places where confidence was not optional. He was well-dressed, well-mannered, and clearly possessed of money, though he was not ostentatious about it. He paid his bills promptly. He was generous with the staff. He stayed at the Washington Hotel for the winter of 1820 and became, according to Morris, one of the most popular guests the establishment had ever hosted. He was charming in conversation, adventurous in story, and possessed of the specific quality that marks people who have lived in the margins of the known world. He had seen things. He had done things. The stories he told around the fire in the evenings were not the stories of a man who had spent his life in counting houses and drawing rooms. In the spring, he left. He came back in 1822, stayed again through the winter, left again in the spring. And it was before this second departure that he gave Morris the locked iron box and the instruction not to open it. He told Morris he was heading west, into territory that was not entirely safe. He said that if he had not returned or sent word within 10 years, Morris should open the box. Inside, he would find a letter explaining everything, and papers that would be meaningless without a key that Morris would receive by mail from a friend. 10 years passed. No letter arrived. No key came in the mail. Morris opened the box. Inside was a letter from Beale addressed to Morris directly, and 3 pages of numbers. The letter explained what the numbers were. It explained who Beale was, or at least who he claimed to be. and what it described was a story so extraordinary that Morris, a practical businessman in his 50s, apparently sat with it for years, telling almost no one, before eventually passing the entire matter to a friend named James Ward. Ward spent the next 23 years of his life on those 3 pages of numbers. But before we get to the cipher, we need to understand what Beale's letter claimed. Because the letter is where the story of the treasure begins. And the story it told was not the story of a Virginia gentleman who had made a prudent investment and buried the proceeds. It was the story of a man who had gone looking for something in the wilderness and found something that no one was supposed to find. According to the letter Beale left in the iron box, in the spring of 1817, he assembled a party of 30 men and rode west from Virginia. They were not prospectors, not officially. The stated purpose of the expedition was hunting and adventure, the kind of expedition that prosperous young men of that era occasionally organized to see the territories beyond the frontier. Dangerous, exciting, the sort of thing you did before you settled into the serious business of adult life. They rode into what is now the American Southwest, through territory that was at the time claimed by Spain and contested by everyone. They hunted buffalo on the plains. They made their way through country that very few white Americans had seen. And then, somewhere in the mountains of what Beale described as a location approximately 2 to 3 weeks west of Santa Fe, something happened that he had not planned for. They found gold. Not a small amount, not a seam in a rock face that required months of extraction. According to the letter, they found a surface deposit of gold and silver so significant that the 30 men spent 18 months mining it with nothing more sophisticated than hand tools and came away with a quantity of metal that strained the capacity of the horses and mules they had brought with them. The letter gives specific weights. The first haul, brought back to Virginia in 1819, was described as approximately 1,000 pounds of gold and 1,200 pounds of silver. The second haul, from a return trip in 1820, was roughly double that, plus a collection of jewels that Beale wrote had been obtained by trading a portion of the silver with traders in Santa Fe who did not ask where the metal had come from. The total, by Beale's own accounting, was staggering. And the 30 men faced a problem that anyone who has ever come into sudden and unexpected wealth understands immediately. What do you do with it? You cannot simply walk into a bank in Lynchburg, Virginia with 1,000 pounds of gold and ask to make a deposit. The questions would be impossible to answer satisfactorily. The origins of the metal were not legally clean. The land it had come from was not American territory. The expedition had taken what it found without any legal claim, any recognized title, any paper that would survive scrutiny. They decided to bury it, not permanently, not as a final destination, but as a safe holding point, while they figured out what to do next. The plan was to return to the location once they had worked out a legal framework for claiming and selling the metal, divide the proceeds equally among the 30 men and their families, and move on with their lives substantially richer than they had entered them. Beale chose the burial location personally, somewhere in the hills of Bedford County, Virginia, not far from Lynchburg, a location he knew well and could return to reliably. He and a small group of the party dug the vault, placed the containers, covered the site. And then he created the cipher. 3 pages. 3 different pieces of information. The first page described the vault's contents in detail. The second page described the exact location of the burial site. The third page listed the names of the 30 men in the expedition and the names of their relatives, so that if Beale and the other leaders died before the treasure was recovered, the families would know they had a claim. He gave Robert Morris the box. He told him a key would follow by mail. He went west again to continue mining. And he never came back. What happened to Thomas Jefferson Beale after 1822 is unknown. The letter does not address it because the letter was written before the departure. There is no death record, no report of an expedition being lost, No account of 30 men dying in the territories. They simply ceased to appear in the documentary record as completely as Anne Bonny ceased to appear after her prison cell in Jamaica, as completely as Libertalia ceased to appear after the attack that destroyed it. The key never arrived, and Robert Morris was left with 3 pages of numbers and no way to read them. James Ward received the box and the papers from Morris sometime in the 1860s, years after Morris had given up trying to solve them himself. Ward was not a cryptographer. He was not a mathematician. He was a man who had become interested in a story his friend had told him, in the way that people sometimes become interested in things that they cannot fully explain and cannot fully let go of. He spent 23 years on those 3 pages. The cipher is what cryptographers call a book cipher. The numbers on each page correspond to words in a specific text. The first number refers to the first letter of the word at that position in the source text. Number 73 means go to the 73rd word in the source text and take its first letter. You assemble these letters one by one, and eventually, if you have the right source text, words emerge. The genius and the cruelty of a book cipher is that without knowing the source text, it is essentially unbreakable. There is no mathematical relationship between the numbers that can be exploited, no frequency analysis that works reliably, no pattern that a sufficiently intelligent person can crack through pure reasoning. You need the key, the specific text. Without it, the numbers are just numbers. Ward tried everything: the Bible, works of Shakespeare, classical texts, popular books of the era, maps, legal documents. He went through the logic of what Beale might have had access to in 1820 and worked his way through the candidates systematically. And then, at some point in the 1880s, he tried the Declaration of Independence. Page 2 unlocked. The numbers resolved into words. Imperfectly, with some apparent errors in Beale's original numbering, but clearly enough that the message was unmistakable. What it said, when Ward had worked through it, was this: the vault contained 1,014 pounds of gold, 3,812 pounds of silver, and jewels obtained in St. Louis in exchange for silver to avoid the transportation problems, the value of which Ward estimated conservatively at $13,000 in 1885 prices. The vault itself was described as lying in an excavation or vault 6 feet below the surface of the ground. Ward sat with this for a long time. 1 sheet decoded, 2 remaining. He tried the Declaration of Independence on pages 1 and 3. It did not work. The same key that had unlocked page 2 produced nothing coherent on the others, which meant Beale had used 3 different source texts, 1 for each page. And Ward had found one of them by accident or by the specific logic that a man from Virginia in 1820 would reach for the founding document of his country as a reference text. He could not find the other 2. In 1885, Ward published a pamphlet. He laid out the entire story: Morris, Beale, the box, the 3 papers, the decoded second sheet, and his failure to crack the first and third. He printed the numbers themselves, all 3 pages, because he was dying and he knew it, and he did not want the puzzle to die with him. He wrote in the pamphlet that he was giving the problem to the world because 23 years had taken everything from him that he was willing to give: his money, his time, his health, his relationships. The cipher had consumed him the way it would go on to consume everyone who came after him. He published the numbers and he stepped back. And the world picked it up. What happened after Ward's pamphlet is one of the most sustained examples of collective obsession in American history. The Beale cipher attracted a specific type of person, not the casual treasure hunter interested in a quick fortune. The cipher was too hard for casual engagement. What it attracted were the people for whom the puzzle itself was the point, for whom the unsolved problem was an offense to their intelligence that they could not walk away from. Cryptographers came at it with the tools of their profession. In the late 19th century, those tools were mathematical and manual. In the 20th century, they were computational. The numbers from all 3 pages have been run through every cryptanalytic technique known to the field. The second page stays decoded. A known result, Ward's work, confirmed and reconfirmed. Pages 1 and 3 resist everything. The search for the source texts has been extraordinary in its scope. Every book that was widely available in Virginia in the years between 1817 and 1822 has been proposed at some point. The King James Bible in various editions. The Federalist Papers. Works by Thomas Jefferson himself, which would fit the name. Newspapers published in Lynchburg during Beale's documented stays. One researcher in the 1970s proposed that Beale had used Thomas Jefferson's personal correspondence as the key for page 1, on the grounds that a man named Thomas Jefferson Beale would naturally choose Thomas Jefferson as his cipher authority. The proposal generated significant interest. It did not generate a solution. The physical search in Bedford County has been equally exhaustive and equally unrewarding. Page 2, the decoded page, gives a description of the vault's location that is specific enough to be tantalizing and vague enough to be maddening. It says the vault is in the county of Bedford, approximately 4 miles from Buford's, in an excavation or vault 6 feet below the surface of the ground. It gives compass directions relative to a specific landmark. It describes the surrounding terrain. Bedford County is not a small area. The terrain has changed in 200 years. The specific landmark Beale used as his reference point has been debated for a century with no consensus. Multiple sites have been excavated by individuals and teams over the decades. Some of them illegally, in the middle of the night, on private property, by people who had become convinced they had finally cracked the location reference. Nothing has been found. In 1983, a man named Mel Fisher found the wreck of the Spanish galleon Nuestra Senora de Atocha off the coast of Florida and recovered somewhere between $400 and $500 million in gold and silver. It was the largest treasure recovery in American history, and it demonstrated definitively that large quantities of buried or sunken metal from the 17th and 18th centuries could survive intact for centuries under the right conditions. The Beale community noticed, if Atocha could survive, so could a vault 6 feet underground in Virginia. The searches intensified. By the early 2000s, the area around Bedford County had been so thoroughly subjected to amateur excavation that local landowners had begun posting signs and the county had started fielding complaints. People were digging up farmland, damaging property, camping illegally on private land, all in pursuit of a treasure that 200 years of effort had not produced a single physical trace of. A researcher named Peter Viemeister spent years documenting the history of the Beale search and concluded that the total amount spent by searchers over the 2 centuries since Ward's pamphlet, in time, equipment, travel, research materials, and opportunity cost, almost certainly exceeded the value of the treasure itself. The cipher was consuming more wealth than it supposedly contained. At some point in any serious examination of the Beale cipher, a question has to be asked directly. What if none of it is real? The skeptical case against the Beale cipher is not the work of lazy thinkers. It has been assembled over decades by serious researchers who started as believers, spent years on the problem, and came to conclusions that the evidence they found would not let them avoid. The first problem is Thomas Jefferson Beale himself. He does not exist in any historical record outside the papers in the box. A prosperous Virginia gentleman who assembled a 30-man expedition in 1817 and spent several years making trips to the Western Territories would have left some trace. Land records, tax records, family correspondence, church membership, court proceedings. The documentary fabric of early American life was not comprehensive, but it was not nothing. People of Beale's described wealth and social standing appear in it. Beale does not appear in it. Not once. Not anywhere. The 30 men he supposedly traveled with have never been identified. The third cipher page, which supposedly lists their names and the names of their families, has never been decoded, which means the list cannot be checked. Conveniently. The second problem is the language of the papers. Scholars who have analyzed the letter Beale supposedly wrote to Morris have noted that its vocabulary and syntax include words and constructions that were not common in American English until after 1823. Words that appear in the letter are not attested in American usage until the 1830s or 1840s. If Beale wrote the letter before his departure in 1822, the anachronisms are difficult to explain, unless someone else wrote it later. The third problem is Ward himself. He spent 23 years on the cipher and published the pamphlet at his own expense. The pamphlet sold enough copies that Ward, if he had invented the entire thing, would have made a modest but real return on his investment. Not a fortune, but enough to pay for the pamphlet and perhaps fund his later years. Some researchers have proposed that Ward invented Beale, invented Morris, invented the box, and created the cipher himself, designing page 2 to be solvable using the Declaration of Independence as a deliberate come-on. A decoded page that confirmed the treasure's existence was real enough to validate the story and frustrating enough in its incompleteness to ensure that people would keep buying the pamphlet and keep searching. The technical argument for this position is significant. Cryptographic analysis of pages 1 and 3 has led some researchers to conclude that they do not have the statistical properties of genuine book ciphers. The distribution of numbers is wrong in ways that suggest the pages were generated randomly rather than encoded from a real text. If pages 1 and 3 are random numbers pretending to be a cipher, they cannot be decoded because there is nothing to decode. There is no hidden message. There is no source text. There are just numbers arranged to look like a cipher. The implication of this is devastating. It means the treasure does not exist, that no one buried anything in Bedford County, that the entire apparatus of the story, Beale, Morris, the expedition, the gold, the vault, 6 feet underground, was constructed by a man who needed money and found a way to extract it from people's hope. This is the clean explanation, the rational one, the one that fits on a page. But it has the same problem that all clean explanations of this type have. It doesn't account for everything. Here is what the skeptics cannot fully explain away. Page 2 works, not approximately, not with generous interpretation, precisely. The Declaration of Independence applied to the numbers of page 2 produces coherent English text describing a specific and detailed burial scenario. The text has errors, places where the number does not correspond to the right word in the declaration, but the errors are the kind of errors a person makes when doing manual encoding, transposing digits, losing their place, miscounting. They are not the errors of a person inventing a fake cipher. A person inventing a fake cipher can make the decoded text as clean as they like. They are writing both the cipher and the key. There is no reason to introduce errors unless you are trying to make the cipher look authentic, and if Ward was trying to make the cipher look authentic, the deliberate introduction of realistic transcription errors requires a level of sophisticated forgery that goes considerably beyond what we would expect from a small-town Virginia man in the 1860s. Furthermore, the statistical analysis that suggests pages 1 and 3 are random has been disputed. Multiple independent cryptographic researchers have analyzed the same pages and reached different conclusions about their statistical properties. The field has not reached consensus. The argument that pages 1 and 3 are meaningless noise is not a settled matter. The historical context also matters in ways that skeptics tend to underweight. The early 19th century American Southwest was genuinely full of unexploited mineral wealth. The gold rushes that began in California in 1848 were not discovering something new. They were formalizing access to deposits that indigenous peoples and Spanish colonizers had known about for centuries, and that rumors had been circulating about in American frontier communities for decades before the official rushes began. An expedition of 30 men finding a significant gold deposit in 1817 in territory that was not yet American and not yet formally prospected is not inherently implausible. It is exactly the kind of discovery that the historical conditions of that time and place made possible. And then there is the cipher itself, considered as a whole object. If Ward invented it, he invented something of extraordinary technical sophistication. A three-part cipher using different source texts for each page, with one page solvable as a validation mechanism and 2 pages resistant to 2 centuries of expert cryptanalysis. This is not the work of a con man padding a pamphlet. This is the work of someone with a deep understanding of cryptographic principles that were not formalized in American practice until considerably later. Either Ward was a cryptographic genius operating decades ahead of his field, which there is no other evidence for, or the cipher was created by someone who had specific reasons to make it secure, and specific reasons to make one part of it solvable as proof of concept. The second explanation requires Thomas Jefferson Beale to have been real. And if Beale was real, the treasure is real. And if the treasure is real, it is still there. There is one element of the Beale story that conventional treasure hunting accounts tend to pass over quickly, and it deserves more attention. Where did the money come from? The letter says gold and silver found in the mountains, an expedition, a lucky discovery. But researchers who have looked at the quantities involved and the logistics described have found the mining explanation increasingly hard to accept at face value. 1,000 pounds of gold and 1,200 pounds of silver extracted by 30 men with hand tools in 18 months from a surface deposit. Then a second trip producing roughly double that. The quantities are not impossible, but they strain the limits of what 30 men with horses and hand tools could realistically extract and transport over the distances described. Some researchers have proposed a different origin for the metal. The Gulf of Mexico in the years between 1810 and 1820 was one of the most active piracy zones in the Western Hemisphere. The decline of Spanish colonial power had left a vacuum that was filled by an extraordinary collection of privateers, pirates, and irregular military forces operating under flags of convenience. Jean Lafitte, the most famous of them, ran an operation out of Galveston Island in Texas that at its peak involved hundreds of ships and the plunder of Spanish merchant vessels carrying the last of the colonial silver out of Mexico. Lafitte was operating at exactly the time Beale was supposedly making his expeditions. The territory overlaps. The metal types overlap. Silver was the primary currency of the Spanish colonial system, and silver is the dominant metal in the Beale hoard. No documentary connection between Beale and Lafitte has ever been established. But the absence of a paper trail connecting Beale to piracy is no more significant than the absence of a paper trail connecting him to anything else, because there is no paper trail for Thomas Jefferson Beale at all. What can be said is this: a man with no verified background, who appeared in Lynchburg with significant money and a manner suggesting experience in dangerous places, who made multiple trips into territory where the most profitable activity was not mining but raiding, who encoded his wealth's location in an unbreakable cipher rather than simply banking it, was behaving like a man who had obtained his wealth in ways that could not survive legal scrutiny. Mining fines get registered. Mining claims get filed. Mining profits get banked. They do not get buried 6 feet underground in a cipher-protected vault in the Virginia hills. Pirate treasure does. The Beale cipher has been waiting for 200 years. The numbers are public. Ward published them in 1885, and they have been reproduced in books, in databases, on websites, in academic papers. Anyone in the world can attempt to solve them. Anyone with a theory about what the source text might be can test it in an afternoon. People do. Constantly. Every year, someone announces that they have found the key. Every year, the announcement either dissolves under scrutiny or simply fades without resolution. The cipher continues to resist. The computing power that now exists would crack any solvable cipher of this length in seconds if the source text were provided. The problem is not processing power. The problem is the same problem it has always been. You cannot run a computer through every text ever printed and expect the right one to emerge. There are too many candidates. The key has to be found by understanding who Beale was, what he read, what he valued, what a man of his time and place and apparent education would have reached for when he needed a reference that both he and his intended recipients could access. That is a human problem, not a computational one. and it is the problem that has defeated every person who has seriously attempted it for 2 centuries. Somewhere in Bedford County, Virginia, there may be a vault. 6 feet underground, iron containers inside it, gold that has been sitting in the dark since 1820, untouched, unreachable, waiting for someone who can read the number that points to it, or there is nothing. A field somewhere, undisturbed, harboring no secret. Just earth and grass and the absence of anything that was ever put there. The people who have spent their lives on this cannot accept the second option. Not because they are foolish, not because they are blinded by greed, but because the first option, the vault in the dark, the numbers waiting to be read, the fortune intact after 2 centuries, requires something of you that the second option does not. It requires you to believe that Thomas Jefferson Beale was real, that the 30 men were real, that the expedition into the Western Territories was real, and the gold was real, and the cipher was built by a real man who had real reasons to make it unbreakable. And if you believe that, then somewhere out there is a document. A book, a letter, a speech, a map, something that Beale held in his hands in 1820 and used as the foundation of the one thing that has never been decoded, the page that says where. Find the text, crack the cipher, and the vault opens. It has been 200 years. No one has found it yet. That does not mean no one will.